All right, so yeah, really quickly, my name is Jay Powell. I've been on the business side of the industry now for 25 years as a developer, as a publisher, as a bit of an investor, as working with licenses and IPs. I run the Powell Group, which is a consulting firm based around all of that sort of stuff. And then some of you may also know about my hobby that has grown utterly out of control called Indie Game Business, which is an initiative we set up 4 years ago that combines podcasts and digital conferences and discords and educational services for developers to learn about the business side of games, because nobody else bothers to teach you all that sort of stuff. So with that said, I'm going to hand it over to our panelists, do a really quick intro, tell us who you are and what you do, and then we're going to dive into questions.
Okay, hi everyone. I am Alberto, and I'm working in BizDev for 505 Games. And I have also a past as a producer. So I'm still doing a little bit of producer, talking about people with multiple roles, which was the last question from the previous panel. So let's say, know a little bit of video game production, but my actual role is more on BizDev for 505.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Liu from NetEase Games. So NetEase Games is a game developer that has been around for about 25 years. We've been listed in roughly 23 years ago on NASDAQ. And then we actually have been, very active supporting the best studios around the world. Yeah, so essentially I'm here to get to know everyone in the Nordic game ecosystem. And yeah.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrea Kifu. I am now working as Senior Strategy Partner Manager at Xbox, ID at Xbox. I have a little bit of experience also on project funding and investment, and I have also 12 years of experience in publishing, so I think that's why I'm here.
So I'm Jack, a publishing scouting manager from Quali. So we're about 300 people, multi-platform publisher. Offices in England, India, Portugal, China. Yeah, here to look for great games.
Oh, no, I don't need it. I'm good. Yeah. All right. So I'm going to when we ask the questions, I'm going to let y'all sort out microphones. I'm not going to try to mandate any of that. But so let's start locally. Now, the Swedish game industry is well renowned. I know it's been around for at least as long as I have, because I worked 25 years ago with companies in Sweden. But as we learned last night, the industry is fairly new locally. So from your perspective, what are some of the things that either the local government can do or industry groups around here can do to help grow both from the developer and publisher side of things?
Yeah, so I think a big one is in places like Canada, Germany, where there's very large established game development groups. The hardest bit is kind of getting funding from that very early development stage, whether it's prototype or beforehand, to like a vertical slice stage where you're going to have something to present to publishers to really get that full funding investment. And so the more a government can do to both support that, to help developers get past that hardest hurdle, and also just offer that kind of community building within the expansion of development as well. I think that helps go a long way towards growing the economy as a whole, and just making sure that more developers actually can make the game that they want to make.
Anyone else?
I moved to Sweden 8 years ago, and I back then I was like, oh wow, you guys are way ahead of many other countries, because there are already so many good gaming hubs in Sweden. So if you are thinking about Hövde, where Goat Simulator came, and Valheim, and V-Rising, it's now everyone knows about it. So I think there are already many good things happening. There are so many game style educations, and politicians who are interested in the field, it's fantastic. And but something that would accelerate is having funds. Maybe to some degree similar to what Norway does. There are some grants there, which helps to some degree, I would say so.
Yeah, I mean, I come from Italy, and I mean, in terms of reasons or incentives to work on video games, like what you have here in comparison to what we have in Italy is, I mean, you are very much more advanced than where we are. So, in terms of suggestion about what to do, I would say what Daniel said this morning. I mean, whatever he's doing, just continue to do that, and that's pretty good.
All right, and my 2 cents for all the local people, help your developers be seen. It's like we as scouts and these publishers and you know, Yves and Josh, who were up here earlier, see thousands of games a year. If you want your industry to grow, help them be seen by everybody else in the industry. It's the single biggest thing you can do. All right, so one, Pontus stole some of my questions earlier, so I'm going to be moving around a little bit, but the big perception in the industry always tends to be that publishers are here for money and that's it. They're gonna give you money and then they want their money back. Walk through some of the things that each of you do from the publishing side that goes beyond the money. What are the services and support that a developer can expect from a good publisher?
Yeah, okay. Well, of course, everyone is here, I mean, for the money, for the art as well, for creating something unique, putting a name, let's say, in the history of games, and being in the heart of many players in the future, but eventually, if you don't make money, you just are going, you cannot pay the bills, let's say. So, developers need money, publisher can provide money, but at least I can speak for 505. What we do on top of that is more or less what you said earlier, so we provide we cover the cost for QA, we cover the cost for localization, we can provide marketing, publishing support, whatever a developer needs, which is not strictly speaking the programming the game, we can provide support to do it. We can deal with external licenses if those are needed. We provide pay for the Unity license, we deal with Epic, and everything else in between. I would say we have community service as well, like having a community manager who can help you dealing with players on Steam or on Discord. That's also something that we can provide, even if most of the time players prefer to hear from developers, at least in the first stage of a game, but after game launch, unless the team is big enough to have an internal community manager, that is something that a publisher can do and can cover. And on top of that, there is, let's say, we don't try too much to be involved into the creative process of making video game, because normally if we invest in a project, it's because we believe that that team knows what they are doing and that they can deliver what they are saying they are going to deliver. But we can provide feedback, of course, or we can, let's say, have hire some external companies which can provide additional feedback on top of what we can provide, because in the end, the publisher is the second, let's say, the people inside the publisher are the one who see the game the most after the developers. So we're still very close to whatever is being made. Sometimes you need an external hire. But we can cover the cost for all of this and also provide, let's say, there are going to be people actually working on the game in any given moment, and these people are going to give feedback to the team.
Yeah, so I'm normally an equity investor, so I think through working with our portfolio companies, I think one of the things that I would tell them is to work back from first principles, like what is the core team that you want to build, and do those people have the necessary skill set to work on, for example, community management? Do they have the skill set to negotiate a platform agreement, and down the line whether you need to do porting and so on? So end of the day, I think some developers might immediately just think of the 50% and 70 or 70% or something that they have to give up, and already immediately have an opinion about publishers, but ultimately it is an optimization game with your time and resources to understand fundamentally what you actually need, and then look for the publishers who have those skills, and like the previous panelists have mentioned, always do your homework and check what the developers who have been published by the publisher received in help specifically, and I think, yeah, go from there. So.
Just very quickly to add as well, I think a big part of where a publisher comes in, especially if you're a newer developer, is on kind of the lower risk education side. So you're going to have a team where, when it comes to marketing, PR, influencer management, even platform negotiations, a good publisher is going to give you visibility into that, what they're doing, why, they're going to answer any of the questions that you have. So it's an opportunity where if you are maybe a newer developer, to actually get that experience while someone else is kind of paying a large sum of it, so that if you do decide in the long run you want to move towards self-publishing, you've at least kind of got that experience and know-how, you know, whether it's marketing, PR, community, but also things like certain support you can get from platforms if you include specific tech, like all that stuff that a publisher's kind of offering guidance on.
You want to add anything?
Just the only thing I would add to what makes a good publisher, or not necessarily a publisher, but any kind of partner with whom you are going to have a long-term journey. You know, you are thinking here about 5 years at least, right? I think like kind of pay attention to their, you know, empathy and you know, if they really care about people, and if they are going to be there, you know, if you end up going through hard times, you know, if your country goes to war, are they going to be there and trying to help you? You know, if something happens with your family, are they going to, you know, be there to support you? Or no, if you cannot deliver your next milestone because of, I don't know, other problems. I think that's what makes a good partner as well.
We'll start with you on the next one, so you don't have to hand the mic to anybody. All right. How do you discover new games? If you know, the communities and the governments are going to be helping to promote and get this stuff seen, but just in general as well. As a scout, as someone who's looking for these new games, where do you go? Where do you find the next big hit for your portfolio?
So I'll just talk here about the process at Microsoft, how it is for games. It's fun. We have actually a weekly meeting in which anyone at Xbox can join and pitch games. You can games that you found on Steam, that you found on Twitter, games that are coming via the ID at Xbox channels. Yeah, like games that, you know, maybe someone reached out to you directly on LinkedIn. So it's like any means work for us. You know, just find anyone, you know, and ask them to be your ambassador internally.
Yeah, so outside of, you know, groups like GTR that obviously connect developers to publishers and events, a big one is social media. So on, like, starting with Twitter, for example, there's certain hashtags that publishers know developers frequently post in, so things like Screenshot Saturday, Indie Game Dev. There's scouts kind of crawling those every week, looking for games that kind of catch their eye. Same for Reddit. Even if it's not in the Indie Game Dev, there's things like just Unity or Unreal Engine ones that's being looked at. If it's Kickstarter, you've got the crowdfunding pages. So basically, if you've got an online presence, even if you're not posting frequently, because that can take a lot of time, even if it's like once every month or two, the publishers out there are going to be sort of crawling through it. They will find it and sort of, you know, pick out the ones that kind of catch their eye.
Yeah, like typically we attend events like GTR, and you know, we can go very granular. Like, for example, go into Discord, and typically, you know, publishing or investment deals happen through word of mouth. So I think maybe something that is more actionable would be to maintain an extremely good reputation within the community. Ultimately, I think game industry is still a very small and tight-knit community, so kind of words spread around. And if you're like operating a studio with a great culture, people are excited to go to work. That really kind of pays it forward for a very long way. So we always usually get referrals, and I would say for most of our portfolio companies, they also came from people that we know. Yeah.
Yes, all what they said, and on top of that, I would say there are also agents. Like GTR is not an agency, but they act as agent as well sometimes, so through GTR as well. But there are other agents around. So agents are a little bit like publishers. There are good ones. There are the ones that maybe are less reliable. So maybe do a little bit of research. But agents also have a utility in this business. And on top of that, I would also add to make yourself reachable. Like it happens sometimes that maybe you see on Twitter that there is a screenshot that you like or a small animation, a small GIF, and you want to reach out to that developer and you see that you cannot reach it on Twitter. There is maybe the website has no email. Maybe you need to look on Reddit for the username and see if he accepts messages and things like that. It happens. So if you don't want to be reached, okay, that's fine. But in the case, don't publish the screenshot. But if you publish something, it means probably you want to be seen, you want to be reached. So maybe you can hide a little bit the way to be reached if you don't want that to receive a lot of spam. But put that email somewhere so that if someone is really interested can find it. And one last way to find game is through previously published game of the same developer. Sometimes someone like me play an indie game, finds it very interesting, very fun, and maybe I reach out to the studio just asking what is their new game, what they are trying to do.
Yeah, let me tell you, there is absolutely nothing more frustrating than looking at a game and seeing a developer say, yes, we want a publisher, we want an investor, and then there's no way to reach them, or they just simply don't answer. So yes, for God's sakes, put an email in there or a Twitter DM that you're actually going to respond to. All right, so twofold question. What types of games are you being pitched so much right now that it's just overloading? And what genres and combinations have you been looking for lately that we haven't seen in a while that you feel there's some growth for?
Okay, so for the first question, I would say that recently, personally, I'm seeing a lot of Vampire Survivor lookalike and deck builders, card games. I mean, even if Slay the Spire is relatively old, I mean, for maybe 1 year, 1 year and a half after Slay the Spire, there was not many companies pitching card games. Nowadays, everyone pitching card games. I don't know why. There's always a small card game element, which is not a bad thing per se, of course, but if it is more or less like Slay the Spire, maybe with one additional things or one or two differences, often is kind of already seen, I would say. New genre, new things, also roguelikes, of course, are kind of a buzzword, like at this point. But I think roguelike have a past because it's not really a genre anymore, it's more like a features. A lot of games have roguelike element. Back in the day were called the random elements or procedural elements. Now everyone say roguelike, but that's kind of okay. Games which are growing, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I can think about it a little bit. Maybe someone else can reply.
Yeah, I distinctly remember there was a month where I saw 12 pitches that is an extraction Tarkov-like shooter. Yeah, so these things always happen, and I think when there is this flavor of the month kind of theme, developers jump on it, and it is no fault of anyone because we did a study, typically kind of gameplay innovation, true gameplay innovation happens only once every 3 to 5 years. So inevitably you have many of the similar pitches happening in a particular period. But what I would add on to the great speakers of the previous panel is, obviously try not to kind of recreate or reskin something that is already done. But when you pitch to an investor or publisher, in addition to explaining clearly what the gameplay loop is, what the game mechanics are, it is very important to talk about where comes gameplay depth. So a lot of the games that we see is actually very cool, it's very aesthetically pleasing, and it has the interesting mechanics and all that. But maybe 5 to 10 hours into the game, essentially the player has figured everything out, and it becomes boring, right? It's a typical game design kind of textbook theory where you have the flow state. And a lot of the things is you actually don't reach the flow state after there are no more challenges after a while. So it's really important to explain right up front how do you plan to kind of create gameplay depth and also system and system interaction. So I think that is my perspective on what we would really want to see for more pitches in the future. And yeah, I think understanding our audience is really important, but try to create at least 1 to 2 interesting mechanics on top of a very popular theme today. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely noticed the same trend. There are these cycles, and it's natural organically. There is a successful game coming out like Valheim or Disco Elysium, and then many people are playing them, and then you get ideas. It's like, I love that, but I would add those other features, and then you see a lot of pitches in the next 2 years, following 2 years, that are inspired by those games, which is not necessarily a bad thing if you thought it through. It's like, when I'm going to finish my game, is there going to be a need for, is there like a gap in the market that I'm going to try to fill with my game? So if you think that I can answer that, then yes, that's a good thing. But if it's just because I love that game and I want to do something very similar, I don't know if it's always, the great strategy, the right strategy. Something else we've seen a lot recently is wholesome games, Zen, casual, which they are good games in themselves. It is definitely a room for this type of games, but it feels like there are a lot of them coming in the next 2 years or 3 years. So it's going to be a harsh competition as well. I think there is always a good need for more management, simulation games. They're always well appreciated if well done.
Yeah, I'll keep it short. Lots of vampire survivor games as well. There's an absolute tidal wave of them afterwards. And then maybe a genre that we don't see as much of, and I think it's because it's a pretty ambitious genre, maybe geared at more sort of mid to large size teams, but the survival genre, I think I was reading a study the other day, when you look at the number of survival games on Steam compared to how many do well, I think the ratio is a lot better than several other genres. But obviously, you've got they tend to be much larger scoped projects, so they tend to be fewer in between. But yeah.
So we should be aiming for a wave-based deck builder where you're using modern weaponry to grow your grandfather's farm.
Yeah,
Excellent.
exactly that.
There you go. What do you need? All right. So let me just get to where I am. What are the trends that you're currently seeing? Are we still seeing a boost in VR games, AR games? What are what I'll call non-core genres that are getting a lot of attention in reality, not just in news mentions and things like that?
Yeah, so it's maybe a slight dodge of the question, but what I've been seeing a lot of is progression in terms of like the mechanics lately. It feels like it's always been important, but it feels like it's becoming more and more of a driver. So whether it's through things like biomes, meta progression, different cosmetics, gear, there's lots of games coming out where they maybe don't have a super in-depth narrative. It might not be as deep in that front, but if you're kind of giving different play styles, different classes, different little hits of dopamine to players as they carry through. I mean, Vampire Survivors is a good example of that, right? The game itself is fairly basic, but there's so many different progression mechanics that you kind of have that just one more run feel, and it feels like, Cult of the Lamb as well is an example where there's so many different progression mechanics kind of ongoing at once in that title, and it feels like players are kind of just looking for that feel good, and that's a good way of kind of doing it.
Metaverse.
In the hot potato. Yeah. Trends, well, that's hard, because I think in the end you see what you are looking at, And like in Firefly, we're not so much interested in VR, AR, MR, I don't know what is MR, mixed reality, something like that. Yeah. And or even NFT. We're not too much into NFT at the moment. So honestly, we are looking mostly at pretty traditional, let's say, premium business. And in that regard, I would say a trend that I'm seeing recently, I think, becoming more and more important is probably having some sort of multiplayer element. As in after COVID, I think people want new way to socialize, and and also I see this with my son, but in general, kids nowadays they tend to play a lot of free games like Fortnite or even paid games and Minecraft, but games or Roblox in which you play with other people. So they growing up, they will be accustomed to play with other people all the time, even if the gameplay is not. Doesn't require to interact with them, but at least have someone else in the game with you. So I think moving forward is becoming to offer some sort of multiplayer, which doesn't need to be, let's say, a game doesn't need to be exclusively multiplayer or to require multiplayer, but if a game offers some way of interacting with other people, is going to be a plus in the years to come, and is probably something which will become a requirement moving forward.
All right, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm actually quite afraid of your questions because I'm afraid that these are taken to be instructional, but I think it's rather open-ended. And I think I'll raise two examples. One is that VR, it really can be done in a way that extends your game without affecting the non-VR version. So it's really kind of depending on your scope of imagination and whether the game is suitable for it. So what I'm trying to say is that it doesn't necessarily have to become a niche game, but at the same time, very radical changes. So we have a portfolio company that does streaming games. So essentially, the audience interacts with how the game will eventually become, and that creates all sorts of problems for example, the narrative design for ongoing live services. So in this kind of radical shifts, you inevitably have to deal with, and you need to predict a lot of the technical challenges. So I think it's really important to play within your comfort zone. So I'll say, publishers and investors would typically appreciate it more if you have a demonstrated history of delivering on something. And then that makes the pitch so much easier. If you want to do something extremely radical, then you need to explain in detail how you're going to achieve it technically. Yeah.
All right, so Alberto brought up COVID, so I'm going to use that as a segue here. How did your due diligence process, after you've looked at the pitch and you're interested in the game, how did your due diligence process change during the pandemic where you couldn't necessarily go on site? And how have those changes carried over into what we want to call quasi-post-pandemic, the world? How did that affect the later changes in what you're doing now when it comes to due diligence?
For us, it's been pretty simple. We just had used Zoom or Skype to do video call. And we are still doing that. Let's say that in particular for relatively small project, which for Fairfile means probably games in the range of 1 to 2 million, something like that, or below. Most of the time we just do everything via video calls, mostly to avoid to have key people maybe fly over the world, losing 2-3 days of work just to do a due diligence. Of course, for bigger projects which normally requires many more weeks of negotiation and of evaluation. Often we have actual studio visit, but nowadays I would say probably 70% of the game we sign, maybe 60% of the game we sign are evaluated just through video calls, without meeting the team in person.
Yeah, I think fundamentally it's still quite okay, especially if you have a playable prototype. So I think one of the on the flip side, one of the questions that we would ask is, how do you do online collaboration? How has it been for the team in terms of working across time zones and stuff like that? Because that really kind of takes a hit on productivity, creativity, communication, and so on. So yeah, I think it would not. I have not seen that affect the due diligence process, but we would really love to hear that you are taking steps to solve, communication gaps, and maybe there's those kind of software or services is something that publishers could look into helping developers. Yeah.
Yeah, a lot of our due diligence, kind of similar, is just done through Zoom calls, and then the sort of, once we do sign a game, we always either fly out to meet the developers or they'll meet us. And while that due diligence is ongoing, sort of prior to that, they still meet like every department, everyone in the team, still a chance to ask all those questions. So it's kind of hasn't been impacted too heavily fundamentally.
All right, so we've got a nice little variation in publishers up here. And one of the things that I constantly preach to developers is, regardless of what your budget or your time frame is, there's always somebody out there, that's a good fit for you. So real quickly, without going into any sort of deal terms or anything else, give us the ideal size of game that you're looking at when you start evaluating titles in terms of budget.
Yeah. So in terms of genres, we're pretty genre agnostic. We've got a team that's kind of worked on lots of different games, from sort of social games to hardcore RTSs and kind of everything in between, including like roguelikes and everything. I'd say in terms of budget, we're in a bit of a strange spot where we're not given like a super strict upper limit by management, because we're quite a large company. A lot of what we tend to look at instead is is the game fun and unique? Is it something that everyone in the team genuinely believes in? Which is why when we do an evaluation process, we don't actually tell the financials to the rest of the team. Only the scouts actually know that. And so the financials is kind of something that we tend to figure out afterwards. And if it's the right game, we'll do what we can to kind of get it on board.
Quite similar at Xbox, although we in the ID side we don't do publishing ourselves. For publishing you would go to Microsoft First Party, but we work with all genres, different budgets. There are different needs out there, different ways of establishing a partnership. So it can be only like, oh, do you just want to come to Windows Store and Xbox, or are we talking Game Pass, or are we talking some kind of funding, or are we talking marketing opportunities? So happy to talk developers and publishers, because we work with everyone.
Very similar. We work with everyone, genre agnostic, and primary focus on innovation that can be described in concrete terms. So as mentioned, I'm an equity investor, so our check range is really large, from like 100K to a few hundred million, and we have a very strong, network of partners. We have been long-term investor into Devolver, tinyBuild, with our own acquisition platform called Kepler that launched Sifu and Scorn. A lot of partners all around the world who we know well and can refer some good guys if the publishing deal is the thing that's needed.
In terms of budget, Fair 5 has a couple of product lines. One is, let's say, for indie games, which nowadays are launched through a sister label of Fair 5, which is called Hook Games. And normally for those games, the budget is in the range of $500,000 up to $1 million. And for the main product line, let's say, is more probably 1.5 to million and above. But there are a lot of there is a lot of middle ground. Let's say, of course, games which fall in the range of 1 to 2 million may end up in one or the other, depending on other elements. And in terms of genre, we are not genre agnostic, actually. But we are relatively open to a lot of different genres. I would say that it is easier to just say what we normally don't sign, which are, let's say, racing games, just because we have a couple of racing games already in the portfolio, not much interested in other racing games. Narrative games needs to have a very, very strong proposition, so to stand out strongly for something. Otherwise, narrative games are always a little bit of an hard sell. And going back to a little bit contradicting what I said earlier, at least nowadays, while multiplayer, I just said it is important. If a game is multiplayer only, so that you need to be always online, always in match with other players, and the other players need to be in the game for the game to be meaningful, that is also a little bit tricky. I mean, it really depends on the project. So it needs to come from someone who knows how to deliver those kind of concept, let's say, for us to take it in consideration. Other than that, we are relatively open to everything. So mostly is kind of premium mid-core games, action-based with replayability, I would say, some sort of replayability.
All right, so last night several of us were talking about there's always like that 1 or 2 slides in a pitch deck that scouts and publishers and investors look for to basically get a sense of, okay, these developers know what they're doing. Along those lines, what is the one question that you don't get asked by the developers when they're doing their due diligence that you feel that they should be asking?
Due diligence on us.
Yes.
Someone already know how to reply? I pass the microphone because I'm thinking about it.
Yes, I think one of the things we sometimes have to prompt a little bit is when a developer's kind of talking to the marketing team or the sales team or the influencer team, etc., of a publisher. They tend to ask a lot of questions about, you know, the publishers, like how the communication works and things like that, which is really good. But I think asking questions to understand the publisher's vision for like how best to market it, how best to reach influencers, which influencers you want to be targeting, things like that is really important. And I think it's also important for publishers to be doing the same, because fundamentally a publisher does, you know, want you to enjoy the process, to have the game come out as something that you're really happy with, that you feel has been marketed the way you wanted. And so making sure that there's kind of that alignment between what you expect, what you want, and what the publisher has in their mind for a good way to kind of put the game out there, I think is quite important. So do you ask the publisher's vision for that, and then make sure that the publisher's also asking you for yours, to make sure that there's no kind of like blindsiding there later down the line.
Anyone else?
Okay, I got a couple of things which are pretty important. So on one side, I think something which has never been asked very, very rarely is how revenues are calculated, you know, because of course royalties is a clear concept which most of the people grasp, but let's say what is the sum from which you calculate the percentage, you know, how net revenues are calculated. Now everything of course is in the contract, is in all our contracts very clearly explained how their revenues are, the royalties are calculated, but very rarely that get asked in advance. And another thing is probably a little bit more details on what are other services the publisher provide other than the marketing, localization, QA. For example, there are things which I forgot to mention earlier, like the price protection or sub-licensing. There are other things which can be done, and honestly, I think very rarely we get asked about what we do on top of marketing, for example.
Yeah, so a specific one from me. So for people that are doing live services game, you have to do research on how the publisher is supposed to support you from day one, because the game design for that needs to be baked in from day one. So in terms of how exactly you push the content pipeline, how you will kind of plan for your own engineers within the company to kind of work seamlessly with the publisher for that. So that has to be thought of from day one. And if you are engaging a publisher, which I think my personal preference is for the developer to have a constantly engaged, ongoing conversation. So the first conversation is not you are looking for money already, but rather you're building a relationship and you're getting feedback, you're showing the publisher, you know, what your progress has been. And then given that if you're doing a live services game, it's very important to find out how exactly, you know, they are supposed to support you, and you might find out that they actually don't know how to do that. So I think that is extremely important, because I believe that live services game will become more and more of a thing in the West, around the world, and so on. Yeah.
Anyone else? All right, I've got more questions I can ask them, but I'm going to cheat. What questions do you all have? Let's do some Q&A. Who has questions that they want to ask? Right here.
Hi. Can we go back to the net revenue point? Would you please explain how do you calculate net revenue?
I mean, I can talk for 505 only, of course. But very high level, it is the gross revenue. Let's say that the games, you sell the game for 10 euros, okay? So it's on Steam. You don't get the 10 euros. So when the money comes into are paid by Steam, normally is around 6 because you deduct the store percentage and the taxes. Out of those 6, we normally deduct the marketing cost, localization cost, QA cost. We say all the out-of-pocket money, so whatever we pay externally. So we, like 505 does not recoup, most of the time we do not recoup internal cost, depending on the contract, depending on the deal, but most of the time those are not recouped. On top of that, but if you see the full list of deduction, there are also things like the engine licenses, for example. There are things also like refunds, rebates. Rebates is something related to retail market, which is most of the time not relevant anymore, but is still there. And there may be age rating cost, for example. Age rating is maybe 15,000 up to 40,000, depending on how many how many age rating you need to get. There may be additional licenses, like let's say that your game has an IP or a music, things like that get deducted as well. Of course, has an impact on the cost. On the revenues. I would say these are the main thing. But yeah, other publisher may have other deduction. So it's important to check. Maybe the revenues. I've seen contract from other publisher, very rare, of course, because I normally mostly deal with developers, in which maybe the royalty that goes to the publishers seems to be low, but then maybe there is a flat fee which can deduct elsewhere, or there is I don't know, some other percentage which end up being deducted before calculating the actual revenue share.
Sorry, another question. So is it a common practice to deduct development costs, salaries for the developers?
I mean, I can
Developer
speak
salaries.
for 505, of course. For us, yes, we deduct. We always deduct the cost of development. We deduct those from the net revenue, not from the percentage, not from the developer royalties, of course. As Pontus said, we cover the salaries of the team normally for 3 to 6 months after launch. So because it's helped no one's if the team has no money to support itself after launch of the game. We don't want that to happen. We want the team to be available to provide support to the game. To hopefully the best games are the one in which the developer thrives and the publisher thrives, and both are making money. We don't want to end up in a situation in which the developers need money and need to accept whatever we say because they just need to survive. But normally we do recoup, yes.
Thanks.
Okay, but maybe other
Does
publishers.
anybody else want to chime in?
Yeah.
Revenues and.
Yeah. So some of the bigger deals, there might be something called an ROI target for the publisher. So after gross, you might see like a 25% ROI target, which means that the recoup is like 125% instead of 100%. But you typically don't see that unless it's a bigger deal, like 50 mil and above. Yeah.
There are different ways of looking at it, and every publishers have their own template that puts them aside. And what I want to say is that there are some publishers that they recoup first. There is the money that they pay to developers and external costs. There are some publishers that they recoup first, and they recoup also their internal costs. But maybe there are other things that they offer. There are some publishers that recoup at a certain rate. Maybe it's like from 50%. So from day one we recoup, but you still get 50% or 25%. And there is still another model. Like my colleagues previously hinted to it. Which is maybe more like a legacy from the disc period, and I think it's more common also. In Asia, in which they recoup from the developer side. So if they pay you $100,000 for development costs, then they are going to recoup $200,000. So because you already made 100, and they should make also 100, so that we are at the you made 100. I mean, you made it by being paid, right? So yeah. So and then to start then revenue share after they could double. So I think you should, really understand how they recoup and see what makes sense for you, and if what they offer is enough for you to give up so much or that percentage from your revenue. Because at the end of the day, you can also self-publish, right?
So we're quite big on making sure that we have some skin in the game as well. So there's a few services, quite a lot of services that we offer that we just kind of eat on our side. We want to make sure that anything we sign is kind of something that the team genuinely believes in and is kind of all in on. So kind of varies a little bit, publisher to publisher.
The main question, the main answer is if you don't understand when you're talking to the publisher, ask for a spreadsheet. Ask them to break it down. My favorite crooked publisher story was 15, 20 years ago when the publisher wanted to deduct the cost of E3 booth from the game, but they were showcasing 7 games, and so they did that with all 7 games, and I was like, that's nice, but no. All right, next question.
Hello. After 2008 crisis, game industry was considered as recession-proof industry. In today's economy, though, analysts say the video game industry may be not as invincible. So I'd love to hear your opinion on this point. Do you personally see the decline of the game industry? And if so, what are those signs? For example, ARPU or PPU metrics decline, or maybe something else? And how long do you think the state of the market will take place? Thank you.
I guess to touch on that, I think the gaming industry as a whole is going to kind of continue to grow. I think we're seeing more and more governments that are kind of seeing how successful that industry is, how big that industry is in places like Sweden, Canada, Germany, and there's more kind of now trying to sort of follow in those footsteps to really support it. And so we're seeing more games on Steam, more developers, more people reaching out to publishers themselves as well. So I personally think there's still plenty of room for it to continue its growth.
Yeah, so I'm gonna touch on 2 things here. During pandemic, we've seen an increase of people staying at home, playing games, purchasing games. Overall, the evaluations, revenues for companies increased, and now the behaviors change a little bit, and we see a little bit of decline. We'll see a little bit if you look on the stock exchange, maybe the prices are going down, but it's just like a life cycle. It happens, goes up and down, and so I don't think the games industry is growing, as you said. What I will add, for example, there are platforms like us that we continue to tap or to find to grow into new audiences. So we are very focused on cloud, which would allow new people to play games. They can play via their phones now, they can play in regions in which maybe internet is not so good, they can play on low-spec devices, so it's always growing in terms of reaching new audiences, so that's the way to look at it as well.
Yeah, I think game industry is not really recession-proof, but definitely there are a lot of changes overall. I think, the salaries are kind of growing quite a lot for the game industry, and then how should I say? And I think a lot of the changes that is interesting to watch is, for example, Microsoft Game Pass, and how that would turn out for kind of AA and AAA developers down the road. We see a lot of kind of not so great launches from AAA studios, and that has a lot to do with meddling from the executive level, and ultimately you'll come back to what the consumers want, and a lot of the changes companies would essentially be forced to evolve, and yeah.
I more or less agree with what my colleagues said here. But in general, I think you need a bit of perspective, you know, when you evaluate things like that. If you look at 20, 30 years, you may see different cycles. You know, there have been, of course, back in the day, the industry failed once at the time of Atari. But even if we look at if you probably ask some Japanese studios in 2010 if the industry was thriving, probably they would have said no, because when there was the passage from the standard definition to high definition, cost increase, Auto Studio went bankrupt or couldn't find work anymore, and that has been has been a big problem for a few years now. And then the indie scene emerged, and the scene transformed again, and there's been mobile. In general, there are waves, there are cycles. Of course, now there is a little bit of a downswing because we are coming from the upswing from COVID. But overall, I would not be too worried. In general, there's a lot of transformations all the time in the video game industry, and I think that's just what's happening.
I see these questions a lot coming into, and what I always want to remind people is the media likes to, you know, state the growth or decline of the industry, but they're doing that based on the big, gigantic AAA publicly traded companies around the world. Our industry is like an iceberg. Those are the companies that you see above the water, but there's a massive industry underneath it, fueled by the people in this room, that they don't tend to look at. And I have no doubt in my mind, it's like, yes, we're falling off a little bit after the pandemic, but we're still not even remotely close to where we were pre-pandemic. All right, any other questions?
Sorry to interrupt. Last question, please, and short answers.
Anyone? All right. Yes, Jan. Oh, wait, hold on. Let's ask one of the developers instead of Jan. We all know Jan. Right here.
All right, so Vampire Survivors has just released, and it's a massive success. If I want to follow in that wake and make Vampire Survivors meets a deck builder game, how long time do I have to do that to catch your interest?
Good question. Who wants that one?
I mean, first of all, who knows here that Vampire Survivor is made by an Italian guy? You know, yeah. I mean, in general, when you see a game like that, you really need to understand why it succeeded, no? And which in this case was because it is kind of mixing the gacha slot machine concept with sort of this basic roguelike loop that in the end is very close to the very first wave of mobile game, which was the ports. So I guess if you want to make a game like that, either you need to find a new twist, which is a real new twist, and I mean, I don't know what it can be, but of course, if you are creative, I guess you can find it, or you need to follow up very, very fast, like come up literally, I don't know, 3 months later or something like that, which is normally hard to do. With a game like this, it's not that hard because it's very simple, it's very basic, but it's still you need to be very fast. So probably you need to do it yourself without the help of a publisher, because 3, 4 months, if you need to create a concept, pitch it, get funding, is really too late. Again, unless you have already something ready. Yeah, not sure if I replied to your question. what was it again? The core. Did I reply? Is this enough?
Yeah, I would say that definitely satisfied with the prospect that 2, 3 to 4 months to get it out the door probably isn't. But could I take the insight from that game and bring it to you in your pitch? How long would I then have?
I mean, of course, if you are the first one who comes showing it, probably it's going to be interesting, yes. But I mean, in the end, it always depends. If you come with a game which say, okay, this is like a really existing game with 1 or 2 minor things different, I mean, why are you making this game if there is already an existing one which is doing the same? You know, this would be the question. This is valid for all the game, because now it is Vampire Survivor, but there have been other cases in the past. So it's not really something many publishers have already seen with other genres. So the point is that if you're making something which is identical, not identical, but is not innovating on something already in the market, then why making that game?
All right, real quick, Andre, and then we gotta go.
You know, there've been like so many good games, and they're going to be used for inspiration and references for many years. So it's not necessarily about the timeline and that you have to be fast. Maybe I'll ask you back, like, why do you use this theme and how you're going to make the best out of it? Like, if you replace the vampires with, I don't know, anything else, would it still be the same game? And because, for example, we had today a game that has a vampire theme, and they really make good use of mechanics, you know, with the sun, you know, the shade, and it really makes sense, the theme. So, you know, you have to make the best out of it and convince us.
All right. Thanks, everybody. If you've got more questions, everybody's here today and tomorrow. We're not going anywhere. But thank you all for joining us, and I'll hand it over to Andre.
Applause.